wanted to interview Margaret Atwood because she spent a lot of time living in the world after the environmental collapse that we are all trying to avert. In the totalitarian society of her novel The Handmaid's Tale, for instance, the world has become so toxic that only a handful of women are still fertile. So childbearing is the only role that her protagonist, Offred, is allowed to play. What's it like to inhabit such a world, even in your imagination? Does the experience leave the author hopeless or hopeful? Here's an excerpt from the first ever live green interview broadcast from the stage of the Boardmore Theatre at Cape Breton University.
A quote of yours that I thought was, a couple of quotes that I thought were really arresting, and they're from your book Payback, Death and the Shadow Side of Wealth. And one of them was, as a very young girl, when you started to understand what money was, and you realized that money was an artificial construct, money was a fiction, but the quote is, but how could a fiction generate real objects? That you take money and you could turn this piece of paper into something that was real and important.
It's one of the few entirely symbolic things in the world. So you can't eat money, you can't drink money, you can't live inside money, you could, in theory, make a piece of clothing out of money, but it probably wouldn't stand up very long. It wouldn't be good for that. So there's all kinds of things that we do every day that you can't actually do with money. There's a good book called Frozen Desire, and the title sums it up. So until money is turned back into something else, it's actually worth nothing. It's only worth what you can turn it back into. And the ancient Greeks knew this very well because they used to tell the story of Midas, King Midas, who made a wish that everything that he touched would turn to gold. And the gods granted him that wish, and then he starved to death because every time he touched a piece of food, it turned to gold, and you can't eat gold. So if capitalism ran rampant and everything in the world was turned into money, at that moment money would be completely useless. So there would be nothing you could do with it. There would be nothing you could exchange it back into. But surely everybody knows that really. Money is an agreement that people make. And if you go to a museum of money, a numismatic museum, you see a range of objects that people in the past have agreed were things that you could exchange for other things. And they include holes with stones in them and certain kinds of shells and little balls of clay. All of these things were used as the way we use money. You take this worthless thing and you agree that it's going to turn into a cow.
It's a collective fiction, right?
Yeah, of course it's a collective fiction, but because it's subscribed to by so many people, it's a very powerful collective fiction. And it's very useful. It means that you don't have to be there with the cow, and the other person is there who wants the cow, and you hand over the cow. You can do it by long distance. You can agree through this medium. And they have traced back the origin of money. And it was little balls of clay, as I said. The usefulness of the little balls of clay was that you could make them into different shapes. And you would agree that the round ones were cows, and the triangular ones were sheep, and the square ones were goats. And you could bake them into a little envelope of clay and seal it. And you could send it with the person taking your goats and sheep and cows to be exchanged for something. And it was the first waybill. So the person at the other end could break it open, count the little balls of clay, and then count the sheep and goats and cows to make sure you hadn't eaten one of them on the way. So it was a way of checking, but then people realized, well, we can actually just, send the balls of clay.
We live in quite a world of fictions. We live in a whole...
We're human beings. It's one of the things we do. We practice symbolism. And that's got a good, a bad, and a stupid side like everything else we do.
Well, and that's another phrase of yours that I wanted to ask you about. You also, in the same book, you use the phrase, everything in the human imagination and thus in human life, which suggests really that everything that is human life starts in our imagination.
Well, let's say they're joined at the hip. I don't know whether we've solved the chicken and the egg problem yet. That would be the nature-nurture problem. Do we do certain things because we come programmed to do them, or do we do those things because we learn them from people, other people? And the jury is out, and they seem to have come down kind of 50-50. And they're now talking about epigenetics. So we come preloaded with some things that don't actualize unless they're kick-started by some event, usually some horrible event in real life.
Margaret Atwood, author, environmentalist, and international cultural icon, live at Cape Breton University. The environmental crisis affects everyone, and artists respond memorably through their art. If you found this interview stimulating, you may want to look at our interviews with painters Robert Bateman and Frankie James, composers Scott McMillan and Eugene Friesen, and poet Brian Brett. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for joining us.